The Jets have had a big offseason, but what needs does the team still have? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 22nd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the show. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, today on the show, we're going to talk about what needs the Jets still have. It's obviously been a very productive free agency period for the New York Jets. On paper, it feels like they've done a pretty good job of upgrading their two biggest needs, offensive line, with the signing of John Simpson and Tyron Smith, and then the trade for Morgan Moses, and also the wide receiver position with the signing of Mike Williams. So what needs do the Jets still have? And I think that if you're looking at this team right now, the starting lineup looks pretty good. I don't think there are a ton of holes when we talk about the starting lineup. I don't think there's a ton of areas where the Jets look really weak on paper, which is different from what you'd say at the end of last season. Now, of course, that's if everybody stays healthy, and that's always an issue, especially in the NFL. And it's an issue with the Jets, the team that's going to be depending on some older players who do have injury histories heading into the 2024 season. And depth is a critical thing to have in the NFL for that reason. And if we're talking about a team that, you want to compete for the playoffs, a team that you want to compete for the Super Bowl, depth becomes pretty important. And while the Jets starting lineup looks really good right now, I don't love their depth. I don't think there are many spots where the Jets' depth looks very good at the moment. I think you could say defensive end, you've got John Franklin Myers, you've got Jermaine Johnson. You're hoping the first-round pick Will McDonald steps up in year two. Maybe defensive line looks decent. Defensive end particularly looks decent. Maybe corner because you have Brandon Echols, who may not be great, but a guy with a lot of starting experience, a guy who can play both in the slot and outside. So maybe you'd say corner. I don't know how much you like Isaiah Oliver. If you like him, then maybe he's another guy. You could say the Jets have decent backups there, but you look across the rest of the roster. It's not a very deep roster. And this is going to be one of the challenges the Jets face this year is they're probably going to need to have pretty good injury luck. Now, everybody needs good injury luck. If you lose your quarterback 4 plays into the season like the Jets did last year and you constantly have to shuffle guys in and out of the offensive line every week, you're going to have some rough moments. But you want to have quality backups. And really, there's only one way in the NFL to get quality backups. Generally, it's not through free agency because the guys who are good in the NFL, once they hit free agency, they sign deals to be starters. If you're a good backup and you're on a team that's loaded at your position, odds are you're going to find another team that will give you a starting job once you hit the open market. Really, the way you find depth in the NFL is you hit on those mid to late round picks. Because in the mid to late rounds, there aren't a ton of starters. The teams that are really good, the teams that are very effective at drafting, they find starters in those rounds. But there's also something to be said for just finding depth players, finding guys who can get you through on a short-term to medium-term basis, guys who can help you bridge a gap. And unfortunately, this is one of the areas where I think Joe Douglas has kind of struggled as Jets GM. If you look through his draft history, right now, when we're talking about day 3 picks, Michael Carter II at this point is the only one that's developed into a quality starter. And if we're talking about quality depth players, on day 3 of the draft, I think you could say Bryce Hall was a pretty decent backup at the corner position. He's a guy who started his second season and then kind of got relegated to the bench as the Jets brought in Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed in 2022. Maybe Michael Clemens, you could argue, is a decent rotational guy. He's a guy who kind of moves in and out of the lineup. He's a guy who can play, a couple different spots on the defensive line. But the Jets have not done enough there. The Jets have not done a good enough job in the late rounds finding depth players. It's not necessarily you're looking for starters. If you find a starter, you're very happy with it. But it's if you just want to find role players, guys who can find a way to contribute for your team. So if you look internally, I think the Jets are going to, first of all, try and hit on some of their late round picks this year. But second is, I think they're trying to I think they're going to hope for bigger contributions from some of the guys they've drafted over the last couple of years. And if you want to talk about on the offensive line, Carter Warren, a guy who saw plenty of snaps late last season because injuries pressed him into the lineup as a rookie. And I think the hope is that, and look, I mean, I first of all, I'm kind of hoping the Jets do a little bit better than Warren if we're talking about the swing tackle. But, if Warren's your fourth tackle, you're kind of hoping that he can develop into a guy who, again, you can play on a part-time basis. And it's not so much that you're looking for great play. You're just looking for a guy who's not going to destroy you sometimes, especially on the offensive line, it's not about dominating. It's just about being credible enough. We saw it last year. A bad offensive line can absolutely sink an offense. And Jets had plenty of issues. They had issues at quarterback. They had issues at wide receiver. But, their most fundamental issue last year may have been just how iffy they were up front blocking. And the Jets could not hit a block consistently through much of last season. And I think the hope is that somebody like Warren grows into a quality backup player. And I think if you look at the wide receiver position, Jets had a couple undrafted rookies who saw serious snaps a year ago. Xavier Gipson, who took over the starting slot role for Randall Cobb relatively early in the season, and Mecole Hardman was traded. And the Jets did not get a ton of production out of Gipson, outside of course, that punt return touchdown in overtime that beat the Bills on opening night, that crazy game that the Jets played, that they beat Buffalo even after losing Rodgers. And then there's also Jason Brownlee. And Jason Brownlee turned a lot of heads at training camp last year, had a decent enough preseason. And near the end of the season, the Jets benched Allen Lazard. And it was performance related, of course, because Lazard wasn't very good. But part of their calculus seemed to be the Jets wanted to get Brownlee some reps. And the hope, I think, was not necessarily the Jets were going to get great play out of either of those guys last year. But I think that they understood that the season was probably lost by that point. And I think their objective at the time was, let's get these young guys some experience. Sometimes, especially when the season is going sideways, you don't worry as much about the results as you do about developing young players, getting them some experience, and maybe they learn some of the nuances of route running, having a chance to play at game speed. And the other thing is, like in the NFL these days, practice does not give you a whole lot of simulation when we're talking about preparing a player to play. The league rules have changed to the point where there's not really a lot of physicality in practice. It doesn't really simulate game reps the way it used to, and there's not as much practice time. This stuff has been written into the rules that the players negotiate with the owners, that have kind of scaled back the team's ability to develop players in practice. So I think what the Jets did last year with these two receivers is they understood that they were in trouble. They understood that they probably weren't going to get a whole lot of production from them. But the way Lazard was playing, it didn't really matter. And the way Cobb was playing, it wasn't like you were making your team a whole lot worse. And the hope is that these guys will grow into quality depth roles. And, if either of these guys, if Gipson or Brownlee needs to play significant snaps, so they need to start 3/4 of the season this year, you're probably in some trouble on offense. But if you get into a situation where maybe you need them for a game or two, you hope that they've grown enough, that they've developed enough, that they can maybe give you that maybe they can give you some quality play over the short run. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to youth. Jets have a lot of good young players, but there are some positions that are critical where the Jets don't have it. And we'll talk about what they are as we continue this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. And therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. Therapy has many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. New episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're talking about what needs the Jets still have as the offseason continues to progress. Jets have been pretty active in free agency. Before a couple weeks ago, we probably would have talked about the gaping holes they had at wide receiver and the offensive line. And now those aren't such big issues. And it's kind of nice to be able to talk about the team's needs without talking about specific positions. I think in a broad sense, though, and this is going to be a longer term need, the Jets have certain spots where even though they've improved in the short run, the long run, they're still kind of dicey. And those are wide receiver and tackle, what we just talked about. Now, this year, heading into the season, you got to feel better with Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses at tackle than you would have last year entering the season with Mekhi Becton and Dwayne Brown manning those two positions. At wide receiver, you got to feel better going to the season with Mike Williams as your number two than you would have last year with Allen Lazard as your number two. But those guys, the three guys I mentioned, and the offseason to this point has really been built around three guys. It's been built around Mike Williams. It's been built around Tyron Smith. It's been built around Morgan Moses. The other moves the Jets made were somewhere between shaky moves and moves that just don't really make that big of a difference. The thing with these three guys is they're all either 30 or in the case of Mike Williams, is going to turn 30 during the season. So although the Jets have improved these spots, they don't have a lot of young talent at these critical positions. Now, at some of the other critical spots, the Jets are pretty good. The Jets have Sauce Gardner at corner, Michael Carter II at cornerback. On the defensive line, at the defensive end position, you have Jermaine Johnson, who's entering year 3. You have Will McDonald, who's entering year 2, and you're hoping for a breakout season from McDonald. So some of the premium spots, the Jets have good young players. Other spots they don't. And I think you could also throw in quarterback, where obviously you got Aaron Rodgers. You're expecting best Jets quarterback season in quite a while heading into 2024 with Rodgers under center. Certainly should be a big upgrade over what we've gotten from Zach Wilson the last 3 years. But the longer term outlook of the position is very unclear. A year ago, the Jets were trying to sell you that on the idea that Zach Wilson was going to re-enter the starting lineup once Rodgers retired. I think we could put that thought to bed. I mean, Zach Wilson probably on his way out of town. Wilson probably about to be traded if the Jets can. So now it's a question of who's the long-term quarterback. And, the only way these problems can be solved is through the draft. Now, I don't think the Jets are going to draft a quarterback early this year. You may get somebody who's like a late round pick. There's nothing wrong with taking a late round flyer on a quarterback. You're not expecting it to pan out. And look, if the Jets draft somebody in like the 3rd or 4th round or the 5th or the 6th or the 7th round, that does not make them the heir apparent to Aaron Rodgers. You're not going to plan on a guy who you draft late day 2 or day 3 to take over as your starting quarterback. That's not your plan A. It's more along the lines of, we like this guy's tools. Let's see what happens. We'll be happy if this guy develops into something, but we're not going to plan on it. We're not going to build our franchise around this guy unless he shows us something. I think that the other spots, it's likely the Jets are going to upgrade one of the other 2 spots in the first round with the 10th overall pick if that's where they stay. Because right now, if you look at it between tackle and wide receiver, you got 5 starters. And really, there's only one premium young player among those 5 spots, and that's Garrett Wilson. But of course, there's plenty of intriguing options available who should go high in the first round this year at the wide receiver position and at the tackle position. Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze. If one of those 3 falls to the Jets, I think they'd be happy to get them at 10. You also have the tackle position, Joe Alt out of Notre Dame, a guy who's few rumors the Jets may look to trade up for him. I'm not sure that he'll fall far enough where the Jets could actually look to trade up for him. Fuaga out of Oregon State, Fashanu out of Penn State. There are lots of guys, a number of guys available who Jets should be able to get one of these guys. And then suddenly, like, your long-term situation at both of these spots looks better. And let's be honest, your short-term situation looks better too, because we just talked about depth. Now, I'm not saying you're drafting somebody specifically for depth with the 10th overall pick. 10th overall pick, you're trying to get impact, but you improve your depth by adding somebody at the 10th overall pick in either wide receiver or tackle. Because if you draft a tackle, they're at 10th overall, they're probably going to at least be given a shot to compete with Morgan Moses for the right tackle job. I think we can say Tyron Smith is penciled in, and probably you can say it's in ink. At the left tackle position. He just has such a resume. He's still playing at such a high level that I don't think there's much doubt that Tyron Smith will be the starting left tackle for the New York Jets as long as he's healthy on opening day in 2024. Moses is a good player. I mean, don't get me wrong. I like Morgan Moses, but I'm surprised by how many Jets fans are saying like the Jets draft a tackle at 10. He's not going to be a starter. Like Morgan Moses is fine. He's a perfectly credible right tackle. Certainly a big upgrade over what the Jets had a year ago. But is Morgan Moses so good that like suddenly like he can't come off the bench? Well, 2 years ago or 3 years ago when he was with the Jets, that's actually what he did. Jets got him in the offseason. He was signed to be the third tackle behind Mekhi Becton and George Fant. And it's kind of crazy to say because Moses is probably better than both of them. But Becton got injured week 1 against Carolina. And that's why Moses entered the lineup, because Becton suffered what turned out to be a season-ending injury in 2021 in the opening game. And, Moses becomes a very good backup tackle if you draft somebody at 10. And then at the wide receiver position, anybody they draft is going to be a starter, because right now you have 3 starters at the wide receiver position in the NFL. Garrett Wilson, a guy who's a lock to be a starter. Mike Williams, a guy who's a lock to be a starter. But that third starter spot's, kind of up in the air. Is it Gibson right now? It very well might be. And I think you'd want to improve on Gibson. But the depth here is not so much about playing time. It's more just about the quality of your receiver group, because the Jets are one Garrett Wilson or Mike Williams injury away from kind of being back at the same spot they were a year ago at wide receiver, where they really are only going to have one good option. By drafting a receiver at 10, you're first of all improving a spot, because whoever you draft at 10 presumably is going to be better than Xavier Gibson. But you're also giving yourself an opportunity. You're giving yourself some margin for error. Now, if somebody suffers an injury, you still have 2 quality options, and that second option in the passing game is critical, because it lessens the chance a defense can roll its coverage towards your guy. It lessens the chance they can game plan specifically to take your one guy away. And now if they do, you have a second guy who's going to get a lot of one-on-one looks, a guy who's probably going to be able to beat coverage. It just changes a lot about your offense. So if you have the third guy, I don't know that it necessarily makes that big of a difference, because the third option in the passing game is typically not that big of a deal. But if you suffer an injury, and this is also a good spot for a rookie, because any rookie you draft is not going to be expected to put up huge numbers right off the bat, because you'll have Garrett and Williams as your top 2 options. Those are guys who probably will dominate the target shares. So it gives a younger guy a chance to kind of ease his way into the lineup. But again, if you deal with an injury, this helps your depth. But longer term, you need guys. You need every team that's successful, or most teams that are successful, try and balance the short run and the long run in this league. And right now, the Jets are looking pretty good in the short run at some of the key spots, but in the long run, they need to add some more talent. And this is a team that does have a very good young core. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the Jets lack young talent, but there are certain spots that are important where the Jets don't have enough of it, and they'll have a chance to remedy that in the NFL draft. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about what position groups still could use a little bit of work. I don't think there are any outright terrible position groups, but there are some spots where maybe the Jets could use a player or two to kind of help the team out. And we'll talk about what they are continuing this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. And unfortunately, it's only day 2 of the tournament. It's the second day of the first round, but I know a lot of you already have your brackets busted. There were a couple of upsets on day 1. Well, now it's not the end of the world, because again, you can go on to FanDuel and get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday, talking about what needs remain for the New York Jets. They've been very active, one of the NFL's most active teams in the early days of free agency, hopefully have addressed many of their holes. So there aren't any huge glaring holes at this point in their starting lineup, which is a nice thing to say. It's a rare thing you can say that about the New York Jets, a rare that you can ever say that about the Jets if you follow them the last 13 years or so. But there still are some positions where I think they could use a little bit of help. I think if you want to talk about wide receiver, we've talked about this pretty extensively on this episode. That third receiver spot, right now it's Xavier Gibson. And I know Xavier Gibson seems to have some fans, but he really hasn't been, he didn't produce a whole lot as a rookie, and he's non-drafted free. He was a non-drafted signing. He won you a game. So, I mean, I guess the signing, you could say that it was a successful undrafted free agent signing, but that's different from saying Gibson should be playing a big role on this team right now. I think the objective for Gibson is to be a quality role player this year, maybe be a quality backup. But, I think him as the number 3 receiver, that's not a great idea. So I think that's an area the Jets may look to upgrade. I think the second running back position's up in the air. We know Breece is great, but after him, I mean, I don't think Izzy Abanikanda showed a whole lot last year either in the I know he had a touchdown in the preseason. I know there were maybe a few plays that he made, but I don't think Izzy Abanikanda is that great. He hasn't flashed enough. I mean, I know he's got a lot of speed, but it's not something we saw. And I understand like the run blocking was horrible last year, so I don't want to like blame it all on him. But that's different from saying like I feel very confident in Izzy Abanikanda at the moment. So I don't know that the Jets are necessarily going to spend big. I don't think they should spend big as the second running back position, but something you could think about as we head into the draft, maybe late round back, because running back's one of those spots where you have a reasonable shot at hitting in the late rounds. So, maybe that's a spot. Maybe you look to draft, and Joe Douglas seems like he's always drafting a running back. Every year it feels like he drafts at least one running back. So maybe that's maybe the Jets look to upgrade their backfield. You look to the defensive side of the ball. I like their safety group. I think their safety group actually could be solid, but maybe they could use another guy. Just add somebody else for 3 safety looks, add somebody to join Tony Adams and Chuck Clark. I think Adams could grow a little bit. He's got certainly has room to improve. Clark's always been solid, but he is coming off a serious injury. So, we'll see what happens with them. But I think another spot where the Jets could actually use an upgrade is defensive tackle. And I know the response is going to be they have Quinnen Williams. Well, they have Quinnen Williams. You're right. I'm not saying defensive tackle is a weakness, but the guy next to Quinnen, that's dicey. If Quinnen gets injured, suddenly the Jets' defensive tackle position is not looking very good. And I get why they do it this way because, I think about Quentin Jefferson last year, kind of a journeyman veteran. They bring him in, they stick him next to Quinnen Williams. Suddenly he's putting up some sack totals. Solomon Thomas plays next to Quinnen Williams. He gets 5 sacks. When you play next to Quinnen Williams, your life becomes easier. So it could be defensive tackle could be a spot to save money because that Quinnen Williams kind of has a multiplier effect where anybody who's around him is going to be more productive just because of the attention he draws because he's the guy that gets the double teams. Defensive tackle, when you play a 4-man defensive line, typically one of your 2 defensive tackles getting double teamed and one of them gets one-on-one matchups. Well, with the Jets, Quinnen Williams is going to be the guy that gets double teamed most of the times and the other guy is going to get one-on-one matchups. But Quinnen Williams gets injured. Suddenly this defensive tackle spot, I mean, it might be the worst defensive tackle room in the league if Quinnen Williams goes down. Quinnen Williams, by his sheer talent, by his incredible production, single-handedly drags that defensive tackle room to pretty good just because of how productive he is. But it could be a spot, maybe round 3. There are some guys available at the defensive tackle position the Jets could look to add. It's an interesting spot. You don't really think about it that much, but it's definitely an area where the Jets could stand to improve. And so it's nice to be able to talk about it in these terms because now we're really talking about just kind of touching things up. We're talking about, a little tweak here, something that takes a group that's okay and turns it into something that's really good. And that's very different from the way we usually describe the Jets. Usually we're talking about massive holes, saying this is a disaster. Usually there's some random young guy that you're trying to talk yourself into. This guy could be a good starter. If this works out, if this guy bounces back, the unit could be okay-ish. That's not what we're doing with the Jets right now. Right now with the Jets, we're talking about units that look pretty strong and units that maybe just a little tweak here could take it to the next level. Quite a time to be alive as a Jets fan, isn't it? Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll be back next week to talk more Jets.